These people can't afford this flight." The words would echo through first-class lounges across America, but right now, they were just a whisper of prejudice waiting to explode. Dr. Isaiah Washington had no idea that in exactly 6 hours, those words would change everything, not just for his family, but for an entire industry that had grown comfortable with its quiet cruelties. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Washington family's Detroit home, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors, where 7-year-old Zara sat cross-legged, carefully braiding the hair of her favorite doll. Her 5-year-old brother Caleb was building an elaborate tower out of breakfast cereal boxes, his tongue poking out in concentration as he balanced a Cheerios box on top of a Lucky Charms container. "Daddy, why do rich people dress all fancy but you don't?" Zara asked without looking up from her doll, her small fingers working with the kind of precision that made Isaiah marvel at how children could be so focused and so scattered at the same time. Isaiah paused in the middle of buttering his toast, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he considered his daughter's question. He was wearing his usual weekend uniform, faded Levi's with a small hole in the left knee, a plain gray hoodie that had seen better days, and a pair of white sneakers that Keisha kept threatening to throw away because the soles were starting to separate from the canvas. "Well, baby girl," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I think maybe the question is whether the clothes make the person special, or whether the person makes the clothes special." He reached over and gently touched one of her braids, marveling at how his daughter's mind worked, how she could ask questions that cut straight to the heart of things that adults spent years trying to understand. Keisha Washington looked up from where she was packing snacks for their flight, her surgical precision evident even in the way she arranged crackers and fruit pouches in their carry-on bag. After 12 years of marriage, she still felt a flutter of pride when she watched Isaiah with their children, the way he never dismissed their questions, never made them feel small for wondering about the world. "Your father," she said, zipping up the snack bag with a satisfied smile, "has never believed that expensive clothes make you a better person, and I think that's one of the reasons I fell in love with him." She walked over and kissed the top of Isaiah's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with the coffee he'd been drinking since 5 in the morning. Isaiah had been awake since dawn, not because he had to be, but because his mind was still processing what had happened yesterday afternoon in the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of the Renaissance Center. The acquisition papers for Skywings Airlines were signed, sealed, and filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. As of 9 a.m. Eastern Time yesterday, Dr. Isaiah Washington owned 100% of Skywings Airlines, a regional carrier that operated flights across the eastern United States and had been struggling financially for the past 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on him that their first flight as a family on his airline would also be the first time most people would have no idea who he was. Isaiah had built his fortune quietly through a series of tech innovations that had revolutionized logistics and supply chain management, but he had always insisted on staying out of the spotlight, on letting his work speak for itself rather than his bank account. "Are we really flying in the fancy seats?" Caleb asked, abandoning his cereal tower to climb onto his father's lap, his small hands immediately going to Isaiah's face to turn it toward him, demanding full attention in the way that only 5-year-olds could manage. "We are indeed flying in the fancy seats," Isaiah confirmed, making his voice appropriately dramatic, which caused Caleb to giggle and clap his hands together. "First class, all the way to London, with seats that turn into beds and ice cream that comes in real glass bowls." But even as he said it, Isaiah felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had every time they'd traveled as a family over the past few years. It was the awareness that their presence in first class would be noticed, that there would be looks and whispers, that some flight attendant or gate agent or fellow passenger would make assumptions about how they could afford those seats, about whether they belonged in that space. Keisha caught his eye across the kitchen table, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. They had talked about it the night before, after the children were asleep, about whether they should fly commercially or take a private jet about whether it was worth the potential hassle and humiliation just to prove a point about normalcy. I want them to grow up thinking the world is fair, Keisha had whispered into the darkness of their bedroom, her hand finding his across the space between their pillows. But I also don't want them to be naive about what's waiting for them out there. Maybe Isaiah had replied, his voice equally quiet. The only way the world becomes fair is if we keep showing up in spaces where people don't expect to see us, and we do it with such grace and dignity that they have to question their assumptions. Now, watching Zara carefully put her doll's hair into tiny ponytails and listening to Caleb's excited chatter about whether airplane ice cream tasted different from regular ice cream, Isaiah felt that familiar mix of determination and protectiveness that came with being a black father in America. He wanted his children to be confident to believe they belonged anywhere they wanted to go, but he also knew he had to prepare them for the reality that not everyone would welcome them with open arms. Zara, he said, waiting until she looked up from her doll. What would you do if someone told you that you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be? She considered this question with the seriousness that she brought to all of life's important matters, her brow furrowing slightly as she thought it through. I guess I would ask them why they think that, she said finally. And then I would tell them that everybody belongs everywhere if they're being nice and not hurting anybody. Isaiah exchanged another look with Keisha, both of them marveling at their daughter's innate sense of justice, her ability to cut through complexity and get to the heart of what mattered. If only the adult world operated on Zara's principles, Isaiah thought how different everything would be. As they finished breakfast and gathered their luggage, Isaiah's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Chen, the CEO of Skywings Airlines. Looking forward to working with you, the message read. Have a wonderful flight today. The crew has been notified to take excellent care of your family. Isaiah showed the message to Keisha, who nodded approvingly. At least we know the flight crew will be professional, she said, but there was still a note of caution in her voice. The wariness that came from too many experiences where professionalism had been selective, where excellent care had depended on assumptions about their ability to pay for it. Whatever happens, Isaiah said, pulling his family into a group hug that smelled like maple syrup, and possibility we handle it together with dignity and grace. And if anyone gives us trouble, we remember that we have nothing to prove to anybody except ourselves. The drive from Detroit to the airport was filled with the kind of comfortable family chatter that Isaiah had learned to treasure, the easy back and forth between Keisha and the kids about what they would see in London, about whether the Queen lived in a real castle, about whether British kids sounded funny when they talked, or if American kids sounded funny to them. Isaiah had insisted on driving himself to the airport, despite Keisha's gentle suggestion that they could hire a car service or take one of the company vehicles. I want this to feel normal, he had explained, like a regular family going on a regular vacation, not like some corporate retreat or business obligation. But as they pulled into the parking garage at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this trip was going to be regular. The acquisition of Skywings had been kept completely confidential, with only a handful of people at the highest levels of both companies knowing that the deal had gone through. By Monday morning, the announcement would be public. But for now, Isaiah was just another passenger, another customer, another black man in a hoodie trying to board a plane with his family. Look at all the airplanes! Caleb pressed his face against the car window as they walked across the sky bridge from the parking garage to the terminal, his breath fogging up the glass as he tried to count all the aircraft lined up at the gates. That's our airline, Isaiah said, pointing to a Skywings jet that was being refueled at a nearby gate, its blue and silver livery gleaming in the morning sun. Well, he added with a small smile that only Keisha caught one of our airplanes. The check-in process went smoothly. Their first-class tickets printed without question by an efficient agent who complimented Zara on her bright purple dress and asked Caleb if he was excited about his first trip to Europe. But Isaiah noticed the way other passengers in line looked at them, the quick glances that took in their casual clothes and their skin color and tried to make sense of the contradiction between their appearance and their obvious destination. Security was equally routine, though Isaiah caught the TSA agent doing a double-take when she saw first class printed on their boarding passes. She was professional, even friendly, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was trying to solve a puzzle, trying to figure out what she might be missing. Daddy, Zara whispered as they gathered their belongings from the security bins that Lady looked surprised. Do you think she's never seen kids in first class before? Maybe not kids as awesome as you and Caleb, Isaiah replied. But he felt Keisha's hand squeeze his arm, a silent acknowledgement that their daughter was already learning to notice things that no 7-year-old should have to think about. The first-class lounge was a study in quiet luxury, all leather chairs and subdued lighting with complimentary food and drinks that were presented with the kind of casual elegance that suggested this was simply how life should be lived. Isaiah had been in dozens of similar lounges around the world, but he had learned to brace himself for the moment when they walked through the door, for the brief pause in conversation, the subtle shift in atmosphere that happened when people looked up and saw something they weren't expecting. Today was no different. As they settled into a cluster of chairs near the window, Isaiah was aware of the other passengers in the lounge, mostly business travelers in expensive suits who looked like they spent more time in airports than in their own homes. There were a few glances, some more subtle than others, and he could practically hear the mental calculations happening. Nice clothes would have been one thing, but the casual attire combined with the first-class lounge access didn't fit the expected pattern. Are those people staring at us? Zara asked, her voice carrying just enough to make several nearby passengers suddenly become very interested in their phones and laptops. Keisha leaned down to her daughter's level, her voice gentle but clear. Sometimes sweetheart people stare because they're not used to seeing families that look like ours in places like this. It's not because we don't belong here, it's because they need to expand their idea of who belongs here. Isaiah watched his wife handle the moment with the kind of grace that had made him fall in love with her in the first place, the way she could acknowledge an uncomfortable truth without letting it diminish their dignity or their daughter's confidence. Keisha had grown up in a family of doctors and lawyers, people who had fought their way into spaces where they weren't always welcome, and she had learned early how to carry herself with quiet authority that demanded respect. But we do belong here, right? Caleb asked, climbing onto Isaiah's lap and looking around the lounge with wide eyes that took in everything from the fresh flowers on the reception desk to the business travelers typing furiously on their laptops. We belong here, Isaiah confirmed, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach the people who had been stealing glances in their direction. Because we bought tickets, because we're paying customers. And because this is America, where your worth isn't determined by what you look like or what you're wearing. He pulled out his phone to check their gate information and noticed that their flight to JFK was listed as on time, departing in 45 minutes. From there, they would have a 2-hour layover before boarding their international flight to London, plenty of time to grab dinner and let the kids stretch their legs before the long overnight journey. Look, Keisha said, pointing out the window at the tarmac where ground crews were loading luggage onto a Skywings aircraft. There's another one of Daddy's airplanes. How many airplanes do you have? Daddy, Zara asked, and Isaiah realized that his children didn't fully understand what had happened yesterday, didn't comprehend that their father had just purchased an entire airline, that every Skywings aircraft they saw was now technically part of their family's business. 47, he said, and watched both children's eyes widen in amazement. But the important thing to remember is that owning something doesn't make you better than other people. It just means you have more responsibility to treat people fairly and make sure everyone feels welcome. As their departure time approached, Isaiah found himself thinking about the phone call he'd had with Margaret Chen the day before after the acquisition papers were signed. She had been enthusiastic about his vision for the company, His plans to expand routes to underserved communities, to create job training programs for young people who couldn't afford traditional aviation education, to make air travel more accessible and more welcoming for everyone. "We've had some challenges with company culture," Margaret had admitted during that conversation, her voice careful but honest. "Some of our regional managers have been focused more on cost-cutting than customer service, and I think we've lost sight of what hospitality really means." Isaiah had made a mental note to review the personnel files and customer service reports to get a better sense of where the problems were and how they could be addressed. But that was a Monday morning concern, something to tackle when he was back in the office and ready to dive into the operational details of running an airline. Right now, he was just a father trying to get his family safely and comfortably to London, hoping that their first experience as passengers on his airline would be smooth and uneventful, that they could travel from Detroit to JFK to Heathrow without incident, without confrontation, without having to prove their right to occupy the seats they had purchased. As they gathered their carry-on bags and headed toward the gate, Isaiah caught Keisha's eye and saw his own mixture of anticipation and apprehension reflected in her expression. They had flown together dozens of times over the years, but somehow this felt different, more charged with possibility and potential for things to go wrong. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, taking her hand as they walked down the concourse, "we handle it together." Blake Thornfield stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his corner office at JFK Terminal 4, adjusting his platinum blonde hair with the kind of precision that suggested he believed his appearance was a crucial component of his professional success. His reflection showed a man who had spent considerable time and money crafting an image of executive authority: the perfectly fitted charcoal suit, the silk tie in aggressive red, the Swiss watch that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. At 38, Blake had clawed his way up the corporate ladder at Skywings Airlines through a combination of ruthless cost-cutting and what he preferred to call operational efficiency. His office walls were covered with certificates and awards, recognizing his achievements in reducing expenditures, streamlining procedures, and maintaining what the company euphemistically called brand standards. Blake's interpretation of brand standards had evolved over his 7 years with Skywings into something that would have made the company's legal department nervous if they had been paying closer attention. He had developed an elaborate system for identifying what he considered suspicious passenger activity, a category that seemed to disproportionately include people of color who had somehow managed to purchase first-class tickets. Premium cabin integrity, Blake called it in his monthly reports to corporate headquarters, and he took considerable pride in his ability to spot passengers who, in his estimation, didn't belong in the front of the aircraft. He had become expert at finding reasons to question ticket authenticity to suggest that payment methods might be fraudulent to delay boarding while conducting security verification procedures that somehow only seemed to apply to certain types of customers. His assistant, Jennifer, knocked on the office door frame and peered in with the kind of nervous expression that had become increasingly common among his staff over the past few years. "Mr. Thornfield, Flight 847 to Heathrow is boarding in 30 minutes, and you asked me to let you know if there were any, image issues with the passenger manifest." Blake turned away from the mirror, straightening his tie one final time before giving Jennifer his full attention. She was a competent assistant, efficient and discreet, but he had noticed that she seemed uncomfortable with some of his passenger screening procedures, as if she didn't fully appreciate the delicate nature of maintaining Skywings' reputation as a premium carrier. "What kind of image issues?" he asked, though he was already reaching for his jacket and preparing to head down to the gate. Blake had developed a sixth sense for these situations, an ability to identify potential problems before they became public relations disasters. "Well," Jennifer said, consulting her tablet with obvious reluctance, "there's a family in first class that might not match our typical demographic profile. The Washington family seats 2A through 3B. Dr. Isaiah Washington, his wife, and 2 children. Blake felt a familiar surge of irritation mixed with professional satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of situation that required his personal attention, the sort of potential brand integrity issue that could spiral out of control if not handled properly. "Doctor, you said? What kind of doctor?" "The manifest doesn't specify," Jennifer replied. "But the tickets were purchased with a corporate credit card full fare. No upgrades or promotional pricing." "Corporate card." Blake repeated his suspicion growing. "What company?" Jennifer checked her tablet again. "Washington Industries, LLC. I tried to look it up, but I couldn't find much information online. It might be some kind of shell company or tax haven situation." Blake nodded grimly. He had seen this before, people who had somehow gotten access to corporate credit cards either through identity theft or some kind of fraud scheme using them to purchase expensive tickets before the card companies caught on and reversed the charges. By the time the airlines realized what had happened, the passengers had already received service they had no right to, and the companies were left eating the cost. "I'll handle this personally," Blake said, checking his appearance one more time in the small mirror beside his office door. "Cancel my 2 p.m. meeting and tell the gate agents at 847 that I'll be conducting the boarding process myself." This was Blake's favorite part of his job, the moment when he could exercise his authority to protect Skywing's interests and maintain the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expected. He had developed a reputation among the gate agents and flight crews for his ability to handle these delicate situations with just the right combination of firmness and diplomacy, removing problematic passengers without creating scenes that might embarrass the airline or disturb other customers. As he walked through the terminal toward Gate 12, Blake reviewed his strategy for dealing with the Washington family. He would approach them politely, professionally, with the kind of respectful skepticism that suggested he was simply doing his job. He would ask to verify their tickets, express concern about potential payment issues, and give them an opportunity to resolve the situation quietly by accepting seats in economy class. If they insisted on making a scene, if they tried to play what Blake privately called the race card, he would remain calm and professional while making it clear that their behavior was exactly the kind of disruption that premium passengers shouldn't have to tolerate. He had perfected this approach over the years, and it had never failed to achieve the desired result. The problematic passengers were removed. The other first-class customers were reassured that Skywings took their comfort seriously, and Blake's reputation as someone who could handle difficult situations was enhanced. Blake's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife. "Don't forget Emma's soccer game tonight. She's expecting you to be there." He frowned at the screen, irritated by the reminder of domestic obligations when he had important work to do. Emma was his 12-year-old daughter, and her weekend soccer games had become increasingly inconvenient as his responsibilities at Skywings had expanded. He typed back quickly. "Might be late. Dealing with passenger situation. Important for my promotion." The promotion he was referring to was the Vice President of Operations position that would be opening up in the next quarter, a job that would mean a substantial salary increase, a bigger office, and the kind of corporate recognition that Blake felt he deserved after years of protecting Skywing's interests. His supervisor had hinted that the position would go to whoever demonstrated the most commitment to maintaining operational excellence and brand integrity criteria that Blake felt confident he could meet. As he approached Gate 12, Blake could see the boarding area beginning to fill with passengers, the usual mix of business travelers and vacation families that made up most international flights. He spotted the first-class boarding line and immediately identified what he assumed was the Washington family. A black man in casual clothes, with a woman and 2 children, all of them looking decidedly out of place among the other premium passengers. Blake felt a surge of professional confidence as he approached the gate podium. This was what he did best, what had earned him recognition and advancement throughout his career. In 10 minutes, the situation would be resolved. The appropriate passengers would be in their proper seats, and Blake would have another success story to add to his performance review. He had no way of knowing that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his professional life. The first-class boarding area at Gate 12 hummed with the quiet efficiency of international travel passengers checking their phones one last time adjusting carry-on bags and mentally preparing for the 6-hour flight to London. The Washington family stood in the priority boarding line, their casual attire a stark contrast to the business suits and designer luggage that surrounded them, but their demeanor was relaxed and confident, the bearing of people who belonged exactly where they were. Blake Thornfield approached the gate podium with the measured stride of someone who took his authority seriously, his platinum blonde hair catching the overhead lights as he surveyed the boarding area with the practiced eye of a regional operations manager who had seen every possible variation of passenger behavior. He positioned himself behind the boarding scanner, dismissed the regular gate agent with a curt nod, and prepared to personally oversee what he was certain would be a textbook example of passenger screening. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced, his voice carrying the kind of practiced professionalism that suggested both competence and authority. "We'll be beginning first-class boarding momentarily. Please have your boarding passes and identification readily available for verification." Isaiah Washington stepped forward as the first passenger in line, his phone in hand with his digital boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen, the familiar Skywings logo framing the flight details and seat assignments. His children flanked him on either side, Zara holding his left hand while Caleb clung to Keisha's arm, both of them vibrating with the excitement that came with their first international flight. Blake looked at Isaiah, and Isaiah watched the man's eyes perform a quick visual assessment that started with his worn sneakers, traveled up his faded jeans and plain hoodie, lingered on his skin color, and concluded with an expression that suggested he had found exactly what he had been expecting to find. It was a look Isaiah had seen countless times over the years in business meetings, at school events, in restaurants and hotels and airplane lounges, the expression of someone making calculations about worthiness and belonging based on appearance rather than facts. Sir Blake said, his tone polite but edged with skepticism. "I'll need to verify your boarding pass information before we can proceed with boarding." Isaiah held out his phone, the screen clearly displaying his name seat assignment, 2A, and the first-class designation that should have made this interaction routine and brief. "Of course," he said, his voice calm and accommodating, though Keisha caught the slight tightening around his eyes that told her he was already preparing for what was likely to come. Blake looked at the screen but made no move to scan the QR code with his handheld device. Instead, he frowned, as if he were seeing something concerning something that required additional scrutiny. "There seems to be some confusion here," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of other passengers in the boarding area. "What kind of confusion?" Isaiah asked, maintaining his patient tone despite the familiar knot of tension that was forming in his stomach. Beside him, he felt Zara's hand tighten in his, her 7-year-old instincts picking up on the shift in atmosphere even if she didn't understand what was happening. "Well," Blake said, still not scanning the boarding pass, "these premium cabin tickets require additional verification, especially when there are questions about payment authenticity. I'm going to need you to step aside while I check with our fraud prevention department." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch, and Isaiah felt the familiar surge of anger mixed with disappointment that came with being presumed guilty of something simply because of how he looked. Around them, other passengers began to pay attention, phones discreetly emerging from pockets and purses as people sensed that something interesting might be about to happen. "I'd like you to scan my boarding pass," Isaiah said, his voice still level but carrying a note of firmness that suggested he was not going to be easily dismissed. "It's a valid ticket purchased with a valid credit card, and I'd appreciate being allowed to board the aircraft that I have every right to be on." Blake's expression hardened at what he perceived as pushback as resistance to his legitimate authority. "Sir, I'm the regional operations manager for this gate, and I have the responsibility to ensure that all passengers have legitimate documentation. Now I'm asking you to step aside so we can verify your ticket information without holding up other passengers." Keisha stepped forward, her surgical training evident in the way she remained calm under pressure while clearly preparing for battle. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of making life and death decisions in hospital operating rooms. My husband has presented a valid boarding pass for seats that we purchased 3 days ago. What specific concern do you have about our documentation? Blake looked at Keisha with the same skeptical expression he had directed at Isaiah, taking in her casual clothing and making the same assumptions about her ability to afford first-class seats. Ma'am, these tickets show a full fare purchase of $15,000 per seat, which means your family has allegedly spent $60,000 on a one-way trip to London. I'm sure you can understand why that might raise some red flags about payment verification. No, Keisha replied, her voice growing sharper. I can't understand why our ability to afford these seats is being questioned when you haven't even attempted to verify our boarding passes. What I can understand is that you're making assumptions about us based on how we look, rather than the documentation we've provided. The boarding area had grown noticeably quieter, conversations dying as passengers became aware of the confrontation developing at the gate. Several people had their phones out now, some pretending to check messages while actually recording, others openly filming what was clearly becoming a situation worth documenting. Daddy Zara said, her voice small but clear in the tense atmosphere. Why won't the man let us on the plane? The innocence of the question hit the crowd like a physical blow. The stark reminder that children were watching this unfold, that a 7-year-old girl was being forced to witness her family being treated with suspicion and disrespect for no reason other than the color of their skin. Blake felt a momentary flicker of uncertainty as he looked down at Zara's upturned face. Her expression confused and slightly frightened by the tension she could sense but not understand. For just a moment, he saw her as someone's daughter, someone's little girl who was supposed to be excited about her first trip to Europe, not worried about why adults were being mean to her parents. But the moment passed quickly, overwhelmed by Blake's conviction that he was doing his job protecting the airline's interests, maintaining the standards that premium passengers expected. Miss, he said, directing his attention back to Keisha while ignoring Zara's question. I'm going to need you to calm down and allow me to handle this situation appropriately. Calm down, Keisha repeated, her voice rising slightly. I am perfectly calm. What I am is a paying customer who is being treated with disrespect by someone who is supposed to be providing customer service. Isaiah put a gentle hand on his wife's arm, a silent signal that he appreciated her advocacy, but that he needed to take the lead in de-escalating the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. Sir, he said to Blake, I understand that you have procedures to follow, but I'd like to speak with your supervisor about resolving this quickly and professionally. Blake's laugh was short and sharp, a sound that carried no humor. Sir, I am the supervisor. I'm the regional operations manager, which means I'm the highest-ranking Skywings employee at this terminal. There is no one else to speak with, and I'm telling you that your tickets require additional verification before I can allow you to board this aircraft. Then verify them, Isaiah said, holding out his phone again. Scan the QR code. Check your system. Call your fraud department if you need to. But please stop making assumptions about my family based on what you think we can or can't afford. Blake looked at the phone in Isaiah's hand, at the clear QR code that would take 30 seconds to scan and verify, at the professional demeanor of a man who was clearly trying to resolve the situation without creating a scene. For a brief moment, he considered simply doing his job, checking the system, and moving on with the boarding process. But Blake Thornfield had built his career on being the person who caught the problems other people missed, who identified the situations that could embarrass the airline if not handled properly. And everything about this family screamed problem to him: their casual clothes, their skin color, their insistence on being treated like legitimate first-class passengers, when everything about them suggested they had somehow gained access to seats they had no business occupying. These people, he said, his voice carrying across the boarding area, can't afford this flight. The words hit the boarding area like a bomb going off in slow motion, the kind of statement that makes time seem to stretch and bend as everyone processes what they've just heard. These people can't afford this flight. The phrase hung in the air with the weight of generations of assumptions and prejudices delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed he had the right to decide who belonged where, based on nothing more than a glance and a gut feeling. Isaiah felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the surge of anger and humiliation that came with being reduced to these people, with having his family's worthiness questioned in front of a crowd of strangers who were now openly staring and recording. But he also felt something else, a cold, calculating fury that came from knowing that Blake Thornfield had just made a mistake that would change both of their lives forever. "Excuse me," Isaiah said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that made several nearby passengers take a step back. "Did you just say that my family can't afford these seats?" Blake felt a moment of uncertainty as he looked into Isaiah's eyes and saw something that didn't match his assumptions about the man's background or status. There was an authority there, a confidence that suggested Isaiah Washington was not someone who was used to being dismissed or disrespected. But Blake had committed himself to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of the other passengers and his own staff. "What I said," Blake replied, his voice growing louder as he felt the need to justify his position, "is that there are clear irregularities with your ticket purchase that need to be investigated. Full-fare first-class tickets to London don't just appear in the hands of people who look like they should be flying economy." The gasps from the crowd were audible, now the sharp intake of breath that came from witnessing something so blatantly inappropriate that it left people momentarily speechless. Phones were out everywhere, recording lights blinking red as dozens of passengers documented what was clearly becoming a viral moment in real time. Keisha stepped protectively in front of her children, shielding them from the worst of the spectacle, while her mind raced with the implications of what was happening. As a surgeon, she was used to high-pressure situations, but this was different, more personal, more degrading than anything she had experienced in her professional life. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger, "you are making assumptions about my family based on our race, and you are doing it in front of our children. This is not only inappropriate, it's illegal, and I want your name and your supervisor's contact information right now." Blake's face flushed red as he felt the situation slipping away from him. The careful, professional demeanor he had cultivated beginning to crack under the pressure of public scrutiny. "Ma'am, I am not making this about race. I am making this about fraud prevention and maintaining the security protocols that keep all our passengers safe." Safe from what Isaiah asked, his voice cutting through Blake's explanation like a knife. Safe from black families who have the audacity to purchase first-class tickets. Safe from children who might disturb the exclusive atmosphere you're trying to maintain. Before Blake could respond, he made the decision that would seal his fate. Without checking his computer system, without scanning the QR code on Isaiah's phone, without making any attempt to verify the information that had been presented to him, Blake picked up the gate phone and dialed airport security. "This is Blake Thornfield, Skywing's regional manager at Gate 12, he said into the phone, his voice loud enough for everyone in the boarding area to hear. "I need security assistance for a passenger disturbance. We have a family trying to board with fraudulent tickets, and they're becoming belligerent when I've attempted to verify their documentation." The word fraudulent sent another shockwave through the crowd, and Isaiah felt his last reserves of patience evaporate. He pulled out his own phone, not to check his boarding pass this time, but to make a call that would change everything. Daddy Zara said, tugging on his hoodie, "Are we in trouble? Did we do something wrong?" The innocence of her question, the confusion in her voice as she tried to understand why adults were being mean to her family, was the final straw for many of the passengers who had been watching the confrontation unfold. A businessman in an expensive suit stepped forward, his own phone recording as he addressed Blake directly. "This is disgusting," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being listened to. "I've been watching this entire interaction, and these people have done nothing wrong. They presented valid boarding passes. They've been polite and professional, and you've treated them like criminals based on nothing but your own prejudices." Sir Blake replied, his voice growing more defensive as he realized that public opinion was turning against him. I appreciate your concern, but this is an operational matter that requires professional handling. These passengers are claiming to have $60,000 worth of tickets, and I have reasonable suspicions about the legitimacy of their purchase. Then check your computer, the businessman shot back. Scan their boarding passes, verify their information. Do your job instead of making assumptions. What you're doing right now is racial profiling, and everyone here can see it. Other passengers began to speak up, voices rising in support of the Washington family and condemnation of Blake's behavior. The boarding area was transforming from a quiet waiting area into something that resembled a courtroom, with Blake increasingly isolated as the defendant in a case where the evidence was overwhelmingly against him. Airport security officers appeared at the edge of the boarding area, their presence adding another layer of tension to an already explosive situation. But as they approached, Isaiah Washington made the phone call that would change everything. The call that would transform him from victim to victor, from passenger to owner, from someone being questioned about his right to fly to someone who literally owned the airplane they were all trying to board. Isaiah Washington looked at the approaching security officers, then at his daughter's confused face, then at Blake Thornfield's smug expression of anticipated victory, and made a decision that would reverberate through the aviation industry for years to come. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and placed it on speaker as he dialed a number that Blake Thornfield definitely didn't want to hear ring. "Sir, put the phone away," Blake commanded, reaching across the podium as if to grab the device from Isaiah's hands. "You're not making any calls until this situation is resolved." Isaiah stepped back, holding the phone out of Blake's reach while maintaining eye contact with the man who had just committed career suicide without knowing it. "Actually, Mr. Thornfield, I think this call is exactly what we need to resolve this situation." The phone rang once, twice, and on the third ring, a crisp professional voice answered with the kind of immediate attention that suggested this was not a routine customer service line. "Isaiah, this is unexpected," said Margaret Chen, CEO of Skywings Airlines, her voice carrying clearly through the speakerphone to every corner of the now silent boarding area. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until Monday. How's your flight going? Are you and the family settled in comfortably?" The silence that followed Margaret's greeting was so complete that you could hear the air conditioning system cycling on the distant sound of aircraft engines on the tarmac, and what might have been Blake Thornfield's career aspirations crashing to earth like a plane with both engines out. "Well," Margaret Isaiah replied, his voice calm and conversational despite the chaos surrounding him. "We're having a bit of a situation here at Gate 12. It seems that your regional operations manager, Mr. Blake Thornfield, believes that my family can't afford our first-class tickets, and he's called security to have us removed from the aircraft." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pregnant silence that happens when someone's brain is processing information that doesn't make sense, trying to reconcile what they're hearing with what they know to be true. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge that suggested she was a woman who did not appreciate having her Monday morning complicated by preventable disasters. "Did you say that a Skywings employee is questioning your right to fly on your airline?" Blake Thornfield's face went through a series of color changes that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, from his normal pale complexion to red, then to a sickly gray that suggested he was beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "That's correct," Isaiah continued, still speaking into the phone while maintaining eye contact with Blake. "Mr. Thornfield here has decided that a black family in casual clothes couldn't possibly afford $60,000 worth of tickets, so rather than checking his computer system or scanning our boarding passes, he's accused us of fraud and called airport security." The crowd of passengers pressed closer, phones held high to capture every word of what was clearly becoming a historic moment. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was grinning with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching justice unfold in real time, while other passengers exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret's voice came through the speaker with the force of a corporate thunderbolt. "Mr. Thornfield, are you there? Are you listening to this conversation?" Blake looked at the phone in Isaiah's hand as if it were a snake that might bite him, then cleared his throat and leaned toward the speaker. "Ms. Chen, this is Blake Thornfield. There's been a misunderstanding here. I was following standard security protocols for suspicious passenger behavior and—" "Stop talking." Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through Blake's explanation like a scalpel through tissue. "Stop talking right now, because every word you say is making this situation worse for yourself and for this company." The security officers who had been approaching the gate stopped in their tracks, clearly recognizing that they had walked into something far more complex than a routine passenger disturbance. One of them, a veteran officer named Rodriguez, who had seen every possible airport drama during his 15 years on the job, gestured for his partner to hold back while they tried to figure out exactly what was happening. Margaret continued, her voice now carrying the kind of cold fury that comes from realizing that a subordinate has just created a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Dr. Isaiah Washington is not a passenger. He's not a customer. He's not someone whose tickets you need to verify." Blake's mouth moved wordlessly as he tried to process what he was hearing, his brain struggling to make sense of information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the situation. "Dr. Washington." Margaret continued, her voice softening as she addressed Isaiah directly. "Owns 100% of Skywings Airlines as of yesterday afternoon. He purchased the company in its entirety. The board voted unanimously to approve the acquisition, and the paperwork was filed with the SEC at close of business yesterday." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible even through the speakerphone, a sound that suggested several dozen people had just had their understanding of reality fundamentally altered. Blake Thornfield swayed slightly as if the information had hit him with physical force and reached out to steady himself against the podium. "So when you told Dr. Washington that these people can't afford this flight," Margaret continued, her voice now carrying the weight of corporate authority and personal outrage, "you were speaking to the man who owns the aircraft, the gate, the terminal space, and the company that employs you. Or should I say employed you, because as of this moment, your termination is effective immediately." Blake made a sound that might have been a protest, or might have been the air leaving his lungs, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Dr. Washington, I want to personally apologize for this appalling treatment of you and your family. This behavior is completely contrary to the values we want Skywings to represent, and I assure you that we will be conducting a comprehensive review of our training procedures and company culture to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Isaiah looked at Blake, who was now gripping the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or triumph, but a kind of sadness for a man whose prejudices had just destroyed his career in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless more who would see the video footage that was already being uploaded to social media. Margaret, Isaiah said into the phone, "I appreciate your quick response to this situation. We'll talk more about company culture and training procedures when I'm in the office on Monday. Right now, I'd like to focus on getting my family to London without any further complications." "Of course," Margaret replied. "I'll have the gate supervisor take over boarding immediately, and I'll personally ensure that you and your family receive the level of service that any passenger deserves, regardless of who they are or what they own." Isaiah ended the call and looked around the boarding area, taking in the stunned faces of his fellow passengers, the embarrassed expressions of the Skywing staff who had witnessed their colleague's spectacular downfall, and the confused but hopeful faces of his children, who were beginning to sense that whatever had been wrong was now being made right. Sir Officer Rodriguez approached Isaiah cautiously, his demeanor completely different from when he had first responded to Blake's call. "I think we owe you an apology. We were told there was a passenger disturbance, but it's clear that the only person causing a disturbance here was Mr. Thornfield." Blake looked around the boarding area with the expression of a man who was just beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake, the reality that his assumptions and prejudices had just cost him not only his job, but his reputation and any chance of working in the aviation industry again. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of conversation that was beginning to resume as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. "How could I have known?" Isaiah turned to Blake, and for a moment the two men looked at each other across a divide that represented not just a misunderstanding, but centuries of assumptions and prejudices that had shaped how people like Blake saw people like Isaiah. "Mr. Thornfield." "Isaiah," said his voice, carrying a sadness that surprised everyone who heard it. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that it shouldn't have mattered who I was. Every person in this boarding area, regardless of their skin color, or their clothing, or their bank account, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not something that should depend on whether someone happens to own the airline. The transformation of Gate 12 from a scene of racial humiliation to corporate accountability happened with the swift efficiency of a military operation, as if Margaret Chen had activated some kind of emergency protocol designed specifically for situations where regional managers publicly humiliated the new owner of the company. Within minutes of Isaiah's phone call ending, Skywing staff members began appearing from various corners of the terminal, all of them moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested someone very important was very angry. Blake Thornfield stood beside the boarding podium like a man watching his house burn down, his platinum blonde hair no longer perfectly styled, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper, as the reality of his situation sank in. The phone in his pocket had been buzzing continuously with calls and text messages, but he was afraid to look at it, afraid to see how quickly news of his spectacular downfall was spreading through the aviation industry. Jennifer, his assistant, appeared at his elbow with a manila envelope and an expression that mixed professional sympathy with barely concealed relief. "Mr. Thornfield," she said quietly, "I need your security badge, your company credit card, and your access codes. Human Resources wants to speak with you immediately, and they've arranged for security to escort you from the premises." Blake looked at the envelope as if it contained a court summons, which in many ways it did. His entire career, 7 years of climbing the corporate ladder, countless hours of cost-cutting and efficiency improvements, all of it wiped away by one monumentally stupid assumption about a family in casual clothes. "This is insane," he muttered, fumbling for his security badge with hands that shook slightly. "How was I supposed to know? People lie about who they are all the time. I was protecting the company's interests by calling a black family fraudulent without checking a single piece of documentation." The voice came from Captain Sarah Mitchell, the senior pilot for Flight 847, who had emerged from the jet bridge when word of the commotion reached the cockpit. Captain Mitchell was a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation, one of the first African-American women to fly for a major carrier, and she had exactly zero patience for the kind of behavior she had just witnessed. "I was following security protocols," Blake replied weakly, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. Captain Mitchell looked at Blake with the kind of controlled anger that comes from someone who has spent decades dealing with people like him, people who hide their prejudices behind corporate policies and security procedures. "Mr. Thornfield, I've been flying for Skywings for 8 years, and I've watched you follow security protocols that somehow only apply to passengers who don't look like your typical first-class demographic. Today, you just did it to the wrong family." The crowd of passengers was still gathered around the gate area, most of them reluctant to leave before seeing how the situation resolved itself. The businessman who had spoken up earlier approached Isaiah with an expression of amazement and respect. "Sir," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. "I'm Robert Chen, and I have to say I've never seen anything like that in 30 years of business travel." The way you handled that situation, the dignity you maintained while that man tried to humiliate your family, it was extraordinary." Isaiah shook the offered hand while keeping one arm around Zara, who had been unusually quiet since the confrontation began. "I appreciate your support, Mr. Chen. It means a lot when people are willing to speak up against injustice, even when it doesn't directly affect them. Especially when it doesn't directly affect them." Keisha added, her surgical precision evident even in casual conversation. "Silence in the face of discrimination is complicity, and we're grateful that you chose not to be complicit." A woman in a Skywing supervisor uniform approached the group with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was trying to salvage a situation that had already gone completely off the rails. "Dr. Washington," she said, consulting a tablet that presumably contained talking points provided by corporate damage control. "I'm Angela Morrison, the terminal supervisor. I want to personally apologize for Mr. Thornfield's behavior and assure you that this does not represent the values or standards of Skywing's Airlines." Isaiah looked at Angela Morrison and saw someone who was probably a good person caught in the middle of a bad situation. Someone who was trying to do damage control for a problem she didn't create but was now responsible for fixing. "Ms. Morrison, I appreciate the apology, but what I'd really like to see is a plan for making sure this doesn't happen to other families. Because the reality is that if I wasn't the owner of this airline, Mr. Thornfield's behavior would probably have been considered acceptable, and my family would have been removed from this flight." Angela nodded vigorously, clearly relieved that Isaiah seemed interested in constructive solutions rather than public revenge. "Absolutely, sir. Ms. Chen has already authorized a complete review of our customer service training programs, and she's asked me to personally ensure that your family receives priority boarding and our most attentive service for the remainder of your journey." "That's not necessary," Isaiah said gently. "What's necessary is that every family, regardless of who they are or what they look like, receives respectful professional service. I don't want special treatment because I own the company. I want standard treatment that's actually standard for everyone." Blake, who had been standing nearby, listening to this conversation while security officers waited to escort him from the terminal, suddenly spoke up with the desperation of a man who could see his entire future collapsing. "Dr. Washington, sir, please. I know I made a mistake. I was trying to protect the company's interests, and I let my judgment get clouded. If you give me another chance, I can learn from this. I can do better." The boarding area went quiet again as everyone waited to see how Isaiah would respond to Blake's plea. This was the moment that would define not just Blake's future, but Isaiah's character, the kind of leader he was going to be, the kind of man he wanted his children to see him become. Isaiah looked at Blake for a long moment, taking in the man's obvious desperation, his genuine fear of the consequences of his actions. Then he looked down at Zara, who was watching the interaction with the kind of intense focus that suggested she understood this was an important moment, even if she didn't understand all the complexities involved. "Mr. Thornfield," Isaiah said finally, "I'm not going to destroy your life over this, but I'm also not going to pretend that what you did was acceptable. You made assumptions about my family based on our race, and you acted on those assumptions without making any effort to verify the facts. That's not a mistake, that's a choice, and choices have consequences." Blake nodded eagerly, clearly hoping that Isaiah was building towards some kind of reprieve, some way for him to salvage his career and his reputation. However, Isaiah continued, "I do believe that people can change, that they can learn from their mistakes and become better. So here's what I'm prepared to offer you, after you've had some time to think about what happened here today, after you've done some serious reflection on your own biases and prejudices. We can talk about a different kind of role with the company. Not management, not a position where you have power over other people's experiences, but a customer service role where you can learn to see every passenger as a human being deserving of respect." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, unexpected and generous in a way that Blake clearly hadn't anticipated. Around them, passengers and staff members exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing something rare, mercy in action, justice tempered with compassion. "Thank you," Blake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for that opportunity. I won't waste it." "See that you don't?" Isaiah replied. "Because this is your second chance, and there won't be a third." The boarding process resumed with the kind of careful efficiency that happens when everyone involved is acutely aware that their every action is being watched and recorded by dozens of passengers who had just witnessed a master class in how not to treat customers. Angela Morrison personally handled the Washington family's boarding passes, her movements precise and respectful as she welcomed them aboard Flight 847 with the kind of genuine warmth that should have been standard from the beginning. As they walked down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, Zara tugged on her father's hoodie with the insistence that only 7-year-olds can muster when they have something important to say. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space of the bridge. "Can I ask you something about what just happened back there?" Isaiah slowed his pace, allowing Keisha and Caleb to walk ahead while he focused on his daughter's question. In all the chaos of the confrontation and revelation, he had been worried about how the children would process what they had witnessed, how they would make sense of being treated with suspicion and hostility for no reason other than their appearance. "Of course, baby girl," he said, crouching down to her level so they could have their conversation eye to eye. "What's on your mind?" Zara considered her words with the kind of careful deliberation that had always amazed her parents. Her ability to think through complex ideas and express them with startling clarity. "That man, Mr. Blake, he was being mean to us because of how we look, right? Because we're black, and he thought black people don't have money." Isaiah felt his heart break a little at his daughter's matter-of-fact assessment of the situation, the casual way she accepted that adults might treat her differently because of her skin color. He had hoped to protect her from these realities for a few more years, to let her believe that the world was fair and that people were judged by their character rather than their appearance. "That's part of it, sweetheart," he said carefully. "Mr. Blake made assumptions about our family based on what we looked like instead of getting to know who we actually are. And that wasn't fair to us, and it wasn't fair to him either because it meant he missed the chance to see how wonderful and smart and amazing you and Caleb are." Zara nodded thoughtfully, processing this information with the kind of serious consideration that suggested she was filing it away for future reference. "But Daddy, I think maybe Mr. Blake was being mean because he was scared, not because he was a bad person. Like when Caleb hits me because he's scared I'm going to take his toy, you know." The comparison caught Isaiah off guard, the simple clarity of a child's perspective cutting through all the complex emotions and adult analysis of what had just happened. "What makes you think he was scared, baby?" "Well," Zara said, warming to her theme, "if he wasn't scared, why would he care so much about who sits where on the airplane? Like if he was happy and confident, wouldn't he just want everyone to be happy too? But if he was scared that maybe he wasn't as special as he thought he was, then seeing us in those fancy seats might make him feel bad about himself." Isaiah stared at his daughter, amazed once again by her ability to see past the surface of situations and identify emotional truths that adults often missed. "That's very wise, Zara. I think you might be right about Mr. Blake being scared. Sometimes when people are afraid that they're not good enough, they try to make themselves feel better by making other people feel worse." So maybe Zara continued her excitement growing as she developed her theory instead of being mad at him. "We could help him not be scared anymore, like we could show him that there's enough good stuff for everybody, and he doesn't have to be mean to keep his good stuff safe." The simplicity of her suggestion, the inherent generosity of a 7-year-old who had just been publicly humiliated but was still willing to extend compassion to the person who had hurt her, stopped Isaiah in his tracks. He thought about his initial anger at Blake's behavior, his satisfaction at watching the man's career implode in real time, and realized that his daughter had just offered a better way forward. "You know what, Zara?" he said, pulling her into a hug that smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "I think you're absolutely right. And I think the world would be a much better place if more adults thought like you do." They boarded the aircraft to find that word of the gate incident had already reached the flight crew, who greeted the Washington family with the kind of professional warmth that suggested they were both horrified by what had happened and determined to provide exemplary service to make up for it. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Patricia, who had been flying for Skywings for 12 years, personally escorted them to their first-class seats and made sure they were comfortably settled before taking care of other passengers. "Dr. Washington," Patricia said quietly as she adjusted Zara's seatbelt, "I want you to know that what happened at the gate doesn't represent how we feel about serving your family or anyone else. We're honored to have you aboard, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you have a wonderful flight." "Thank you, Patricia," Isaiah replied. "But I want you to know that you don't need to treat us any differently than you would treat any other passengers. What we experienced today shouldn't be special because of who I am. It should be standard because of who we are as human beings." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Isaiah found himself thinking about Zara's insight into Blake's behavior, her suggestion that fear, rather than malice, might have been the driving force behind his actions. It was the kind of perspective that could change not just how individuals dealt with conflict, but how entire organizations approached issues of bias and discrimination. "Keisha," he said, leaning across the aisle to where his wife was helping Caleb get settled with his coloring books, "I think we need to reconsider our approach to the Blake Thornfield situation." She looked at him with the raised eyebrow that meant she was interested but skeptical. "What do you mean Zara thinks he was acting out of fear rather than hatred?" Isaiah explained, keeping his voice low so the children couldn't hear the adult conversation. "And if she's right, then maybe the solution isn't just to punish him, but to address the underlying fear and insecurity that led to his behavior." Keisha considered this for a moment, her medical training evident in the way she approached the problem analytically. "So, instead of just firing him and moving on, you're thinking about some kind of intervention, some way to actually change his perspective rather than just eliminating him as a problem." "Exactly," Isaiah said. "Because if we just fire him, he goes somewhere else and continues to treat people poorly. But if we can help him understand why he acted the way he did, maybe we can prevent other families from going through what we just experienced." "That's very generous of you," Keisha said, "but also very risky. What if he can't change? What if his prejudices are too deeply ingrained for education and compassion to make a difference?" "Then we'll have tried," Isaiah replied, "and our children will have seen us choose hope over hatred, even when hatred would have been easier to justify." As Flight 847 lifted off from JFK and began its journey across the Atlantic, Isaiah looked out the window at the lights of New York falling away below them and thought about the conversation he would have with Margaret Chen on Monday morning. There would be policy changes to implement training programs to develop and a company culture to transform. But it would all start with the simple principle his daughter had articulated that fear could be addressed with understanding that prejudice could be combated with education, and that even the worst behavior might be an opportunity for growth rather than just punishment. Daddy Zara said, her voice sleepy as the excitement of the day finally caught up with her. "When we get back home, can we invite Mr. Blake over for dinner? I think he might be nicer if he got to know us as regular people instead of just airplane people." Isaiah smiled and kissed the top of her head, marveling once again at the wisdom that seemed to come so naturally to children, the ability to see past hurt and anger toward healing and hope. "We'll see, baby girl," he said. "We'll see." Blake Thornfield sat in the back seat of a taxi, heading away from JFK Terminal 4, watching the Skywings aircraft taxi toward takeoff through the dirty window, and tried to comprehend how his entire life had changed in the span of 30 minutes. His phone had finally stopped buzzing with calls and text messages, mostly because he had turned it off after seeing 17 missed calls from his wife, 43 text messages from colleagues, and a notification that he had been tagged in a video that already had over 2 million views on social media. The taxi driver, a middle-aged Sikh man named Harpreet, kept glancing in the rearview mirror with the kind of curious concern that suggested he had picked up his share of people having very bad days. "You okay back there, friend?" he asked in accented English that carried genuine warmth. "You look like somebody died." "Something like that," Blake mumbled, staring at his hands and noticing that they were still shaking slightly. His perfectly manicured fingers, his expensive watch, his platinum blonde hair that he had spent 20 minutes styling that morning, all of it suddenly seemed ridiculous, like costume pieces from a performance that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Work troubles?" Harpreet asked, navigating through the airport traffic with the skilled efficiency of someone who had been driving in New York for decades. "I've been driving taxi 30 years. I've seen every kind of trouble. Usually not as bad as people think." Blake let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "I think this might be exactly as bad as I think he said. I just lost my job, my reputation, probably my career. And I did it all in front of cameras that have probably already made me famous for all the wrong reasons." In the airport security office, where he had been taken to retrieve his personal belongings and surrender his company property, Blake had caught a glimpse of the video that was already going viral. The footage was clear, the audio was perfect, and there was no way to misinterpret what had happened or to spin his behavior in a positive light. He had publicly humiliated a black family, accused them of fraud without evidence, and done it all while being recorded by dozens of witnesses. "What you do?" Harpreet asked, his curiosity getting the better of his professional discretion. Blake closed his eyes and replayed the morning's events in his mind, seeing them now from the perspective of someone who knew how the story ended. "I made assumptions about some passengers based on how they looked, and it turned out I was wrong. Very, very wrong." "Ah," Harpreet said, nodding with the wisdom of someone who had navigated cultural misunderstandings and prejudice throughout his life. "You judge book by cover. Always dangerous thing to do." As the taxi merged onto the Grand Central Parkway, Blake's mind drifted to the phone call that had changed everything to Margaret Chen's voice announcing that Dr. Isaiah Washington owned the airline. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent 7 years climbing the corporate ladder at Skywings, 7 years of cost-cutting and efficiency improvements, and what he had called maintaining brand standards, only to have it all destroyed by his treatment of the man who now owned the company. But it was more than just the professional catastrophe that was eating at him. It was the look in Zara Washington's eyes when she had asked why the man wouldn't let them on the plane, the confusion and fear in a 7-year-old's voice as she tried to understand why adults were being mean to her family. Blake had a daughter of his own, Emma, who was just 5 years older than Zara, and he tried to imagine how he would feel if someone treated Emma the way he had treated the Washington children. The thought made him physically sick. His phone, which he had turned back on to check the time, immediately started buzzing with notifications. Text messages from colleagues, missed calls from reporters who had somehow gotten his number, and a notification from his company email account that he no longer had access to. But it was the message from his wife, Linda, that made his stomach drop even further. "Blake, I don't know what happened today, but Emma's friends are asking her about a video of her father. Call me immediately." Blake stared at the message and realized that his humiliation was just beginning, that the viral video would follow him for months or years, that his daughter would have to explain to her classmates why her father was the man on the internet who was mean to a black family at the airport. "My daughter," he said to Harpreet, his voice breaking slightly. "She's going to see that video. Her friends are going to see it. She's going to know that her father is a racist." Harpreet was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "You are racist?" he asked finally. Blake started to say no automatically, the reflexive denial that came from a lifetime of believing that racism was something other people did something obvious and intentional that he would never be guilty of. But as the words formed in his mouth, he stopped himself and really considered the question. Was he racist? He thought about his reaction to seeing the Washington family in the first-class boarding line, the immediate assumption that they didn't belong there, the certainty that their tickets must be fraudulent. He thought about his brand standards and passenger screening procedures that somehow always seemed to target people of color. He thought about his staff meetings where he talked about maintaining the premium experience for their typical demographic. "Yes," he said quietly, the admission coming like a physical blow to his chest. "I think maybe I am. Not the kind that wears white hoods or burns crosses, but the kind that makes assumptions and creates policies and tells himself he's just doing his job." Harpreet nodded without judgment. "First step is knowing," he said. "Cannot fix something you do not see." The taxi pulled up to Blake's apartment building in Manhattan, a luxury high-rise that he could probably no longer afford now that his Skywing salary was gone. As he gathered his briefcase and jacket, Blake realized that he had a choice to make. He could spend the next weeks and months feeling sorry for himself, blaming Isaiah Washington for destroying his career, insisting that he was the victim of political correctness or reverse racism or whatever narrative would allow him to avoid confronting the truth about his own behavior. Or he could take responsibility for what he had done, try to understand why he had done it, and figure out how to become the kind of person who would never treat another family the way he had treated the Washingtons. "Thank you," he said to Harpreet as he handed over the fare, "for listening and for being honest with me." "Good luck," friend Harpreet replied. "Sometimes worse day is beginning of better life." As Blake rode the elevator up to his apartment, he thought about Dr. Washington's offer to discuss a different kind of role with the company, a customer service position where he could learn to see every passenger as a human being deserving of respect. The offer had been unexpected, generous in a way that Blake wasn't sure he deserved, but it represented something that might be more valuable than the management position he had lost a chance to earn redemption through service rather than power. The elevator doors opened onto his floor, and Blake walked toward his apartment knowing that he would have to face his wife and daughter, would have to explain not just what had happened, but why it had happened, would have to begin the difficult work of examining his own prejudices and figuring out how to change them. It would be the hardest conversation of his life, but also potentially the most important one. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean flight. 847, settled into the peaceful rhythm of long-haul international travel, the kind of suspended time that allows passengers to decompress from the chaos of departure and mentally prepare for arrival in a different world. The first-class cabin had taken on the hushed quality that comes when people realize they're sharing space with someone who has just become inadvertently famous, though the Washington family seemed determined to treat their journey as normally as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them aboard. Isaiah Washington had his laptop open on the tray table, but instead of working on the technology projects that had built his fortune, he was drafting notes for the comprehensive review of Skywing's Airlines that would begin as soon as they returned from London. The incident with Blake Thornfield had revealed problems that went far deeper than one prejudiced manager, and Isaiah was beginning to understand that owning an airline meant taking responsibility for every interaction between his employees and their customers. Dr. Washington. Patricia, the lead flight attendant, approached his seat with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she had been building up courage for this conversation. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but what happened at the gate today, that's not the first time something like that has occurred." Isaiah looked up from his laptop, his full attention focused on Patricia with the intensity that had made him successful in business. "Tell me more about that." Patricia glanced around the cabin to make sure other passengers weren't listening, then leaned in slightly to keep her voice low. Mr. Thornfield has a reputation among the flight crews for being difficult with passengers who don't fit his idea of what first-class customers should look like. Last month, he delayed boarding for 20 minutes while he verified the tickets of an Indian family with young children. 2 weeks ago, he called security on a young black businessman who was flying first class on a company upgrade, and management was aware of these incidents. Isaiah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There were complaints filed, Patricia said carefully, but Mr. Thornfield always had explanations. Security concerns, fraud prevention, protecting the brand image. And he was good at keeping his language just professional enough that it was hard to prove discrimination, even though everyone could see what was really happening. Isaiah made notes on his laptop, adding Patricia's information to the growing list of cultural and policy changes that would need to be implemented. Patricia, I want you to know that things are going to be different going forward. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like or how they're dressed, and I'm going to make sure that our policies and training reflect that principle. That means a lot to hear you say that, Dr. Washington, Patricia replied. A lot of us got into this business because we wanted to help people travel to be part of connecting families and making journeys special. It's been hard to watch some of that spirit get lost in cost-cutting and efficiency metrics. Across the aisle, Keisha was having her own conversation with another flight attendant, a young woman named Maria, who had mentioned that she was working on her nursing degree in her spare time. How do you balance the demands of airline work with your studies? Keisha asked, her surgeon's appreciation for demanding schedules evident in her tone. It's not easy, Maria admitted. The scheduling can be unpredictable and the pay isn't really enough to cover tuition without taking on extra debt. But I love the travel aspect, and I'm hoping that having healthcare experience will help me move into a management role eventually. What if there were educational assistance programs available through the airline, Keisha asked. Tuition, reimbursement, flexible scheduling for students, partnership programs with nursing schools. Maria's eyes lit up with interest. That would be incredible. There are several of us on the crew who are working on degrees, and I know other airlines have those kinds of programs. Keisha made a mental note to discuss educational benefits with Isaiah, recognizing that investing in employee development could be both a recruitment tool and a way to build the kind of company culture that would prevent future incidents like the one they had experienced. In the seats behind them, Zara and Caleb had settled into the routine of international travel with the adaptability that children bring to new experiences. Zara was working on a drawing that appeared to show an airplane filled with people of different colors holding hands, while Caleb had fallen asleep clutching his favorite stuffed elephant and dreaming whatever dreams 5-year-olds have when they're flying through clouds, Mama Zara said, holding up her drawing for Keisha to admire. Do you think Mr. Blake has ever been on an airplane with lots of different kinds of people? Before I don't know, sweetheart, Keisha replied. Why do you ask? Well, maybe if he had been around different people more, he wouldn't have been so surprised to see us in those nice seats. Like maybe he just needed more practice being around different families. The insight struck Keisha with its simplicity and accuracy, the recognition that Blake's behavior might have stemmed from ignorance and isolation rather than malicious intent. She shared her daughter's comment with Isaiah, who added it to his growing understanding of how to address bias and discrimination through education and exposure rather than just punishment. You know what Zara, Isaiah said, looking at her drawing with genuine admiration. I think you might be right about Mr. Blake needing more practice. And maybe when we get back home, we can find ways to give him that practice to help him learn what you already know about how wonderful it is when different kinds of families travel together. As the flight continued across the Atlantic, Isaiah found himself thinking about the ripple effects of what had happened at JFK. the way a single incident had revealed larger problems but also larger opportunities. The viral video would bring scrutiny to Skywings, but it would also create pressure for change throughout the aviation industry. Other airlines would be watching to see how he handled the situation, and his response could set new standards for how companies dealt with discrimination and bias. Margaret Chen called during the flight to provide updates on the media response and the internal investigation that was already underway. The video has been viewed over 10 million times, she reported. And while the initial coverage was focused on the incident itself, the narrative is starting to shift toward what we're going to do differently going forward. Good, Isaiah said. I want us to be leaders in this conversation, not just reactive responders. We have an opportunity to show that companies can learn from their mistakes and become better. That transformation is possible when there's genuine commitment to change. As Flight 847 began its descent toward Heathrow Airport, Isaiah looked at his sleeping children and thought about the world he wanted them to inherit. A world where their presence in first class wouldn't be questioned, where their dignity would be assumed, rather than earned, where companies like Skywings would be models of inclusion rather than examples of discrimination. It was an ambitious vision, but as Zara had reminded him, even the biggest changes could start with something as simple as helping one person learn to see others differently. The transformation of Skywings Airlines was about to begin. Heathrow Airport at 7 in the morning was a symphony of controlled chaos, with passengers from overnight flights stumbling through immigration while early morning commuters rushed past with the efficient purposefulness that characterized international business travel. The Washington family emerged from the jet bridge into Terminal 5 to find themselves at the center of a media storm that had been building momentum throughout their 6-hour flight across the Atlantic. Dr. Washington. A British journalist with a BBC microphone appeared seemingly from nowhere, flanked by a cameraman who had clearly been waiting for their arrival. Could you comment on the incident at JFK yesterday and what it means for the future of air travel? Isaiah paused, one hand protectively on Zara's shoulder, while Keisha guided Caleb away from the crowd of reporters that was beginning to form around them. This was exactly what he had been hoping to avoid, the transformation of their family vacation into a public spectacle. But he also recognized that the media attention represented an opportunity to send a message that could influence industry practices far beyond Skywings Airlines. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. Isaiah said, his voice calm, but carrying clearly across the terminal space. But it was also an opportunity for learning and growth. My family was treated with disrespect and suspicion based on assumptions about our appearance, and while that was painful to experience, it revealed problems that exist throughout the travel industry, not just at one airline or with one employee. The reporter leaned forward, clearly sensing that this was going to be more than a standard corporate apology. Are you planning legal action against Skywings or against Blake Thornfield personally? No, Isaiah replied, the answer clearly, surprising both the journalist and the growing crowd of passengers who had stopped to listen. I'm planning something more constructive than legal action. I'm planning transformation education and policy changes that will prevent other families from experiencing what we experienced. As they walked through the terminal toward the exit, more reporters joined the impromptu press conference, creating the kind of media scrum that usually surrounded politicians or celebrities rather than business owners. But Isaiah had spent years navigating high-pressure situations in the technology industry, and he handled the questions with the same strategic thinking that had built his fortune. Dr. Washington, a young woman from Sky News, called out, "There are reports that you purchased Skywings Airlines specifically to address discrimination in air travel. Is that accurate?" Isaiah smiled at the question, appreciating the implication that his acquisition had been motivated by social justice rather than business opportunity. I purchased Skywings because I believed it had potential for growth and positive impact in underserved markets. The discrimination my family experienced yesterday has certainly reinforced my commitment to making it a more inclusive company, But the business case for diversity and inclusion was already part of my strategic vision. Outside the terminal, a car and driver were waiting to take them to their hotel in central London, but the media attention followed them even there. Isaiah's phone was buzzing continuously with interview requests from American and international media outlets, all of them wanting to discuss the incident and its implications for corporate responsibility and racial bias in customer service. At the Langham Hotel, where they had planned to spend a quiet morning recovering from jet lag before beginning their London sightseeing, Isaiah found himself fielding calls from other airline executives, civil rights organizations, and business leaders who wanted to understand what had happened and what it meant for their own companies. "This is bigger than one incident," Margaret Chen explained during a conference call that included several members of the Skywings board of directors. The hashtag Blake Thornfield is trending worldwide, and it's become a symbol for unconscious bias in customer service. Every airline, every hospitality company, every business that deals with the public is having to examine their own policies and training procedures. The call was interrupted by a knock on their hotel room door, and Isaiah opened it to find a delegation from the UK Civil Aviation Authority, the British equivalent of the FAA, who had come to discuss the implications of the incident for international aviation standards. Dr. Washington said David Morrison, the Director of Passenger Rights and Safety, "We've been following the developments from your flight yesterday, and we're interested in discussing how the lessons learned might be applied to aviation standards throughout Europe and beyond." What followed was a 2-hour conversation about bias training, customer service protocols, and the possibility of international standards for preventing discrimination in air travel. The UK officials were particularly interested in Isaiah's plans for transforming Skywings into a model of inclusive service, and they offered to facilitate discussions with other European carriers about adopting similar policies. The aviation industry has been surprisingly slow to address issues of bias and discrimination, Morrison admitted. "We have comprehensive safety regulations, detailed security protocols, and strict maintenance standards, but we've relied largely on individual companies to handle customer service training and bias prevention. Your experience suggests that a more coordinated approach might be necessary." By afternoon, Isaiah found himself in an impromptu meeting with executives from British Airways Virgin Atlantic and several other carriers who wanted to discuss industry-wide initiatives for addressing discrimination and bias. The meeting held in a conference room at the Langham felt like the beginning of a movement, rather than just a response to a single incident. "What happened to your family could have happened to any of our customers," admitted Rebecca Singh, the Customer Experience Director for Virgin Atlantic. "We all have policies against discrimination, but we haven't done enough to ensure that those policies are consistently implemented at every level of customer interaction." The conversation evolved into detailed discussions about training programs, accountability measures, and the possibility of industry-wide standards for bias prevention. Isaiah found himself taking on the role of catalyst for changes that could affect millions of passengers and thousands of airline employees around the world. "I want to propose something," Isaiah said as the meeting drew to a close. "What if we created an industry consortium dedicated to eliminating bias and discrimination in air travel? Not just policy statements or diversity initiatives, but real measurable changes in how passengers are treated from booking to baggage claim." The response was immediate and enthusiastic, with several executives offering to contribute resources and expertise to such an initiative. Within hours, the framework for what would become known as the International Aviation Inclusion Alliance was taking shape, with Skywings as the founding member and Isaiah as the driving force behind its mission. Meanwhile, back in New York, Blake Thornfield was experiencing the other side of viral fame, as the #Blake Thornfield hashtag continued to trend on social media, generating millions of comments, memes, and discussions about racism, privilege, and accountability. His termination from Skywings had been followed by a flood of media requests, none of which he was prepared to handle, and he had spent the day hiding in his apartment while his wife dealt with reporters camped outside their building. The ripple effects extended far beyond Blake's personal crisis. Other companies in the hospitality and service industries began reviewing their own training programs and customer service protocols, afraid that they might have their own Blake Thornfield moment if they didn't address potential bias issues proactively. At the end of their first day in London, as the Washington family sat down for dinner at a quiet restaurant near their hotel, Isaiah reflected on how quickly their vacation had transformed into a catalyst for industry change. The attention was overwhelming, but the opportunity to drive meaningful progress was exactly the kind of challenge that had motivated him throughout his career. "Daddy," Zara said as she worked on her fish and chips, "do you think Mr. Blake is watching the news about us?" "Probably," Isaiah replied. "How do you think he's feeling about all of this?" Zara considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "I think he's probably scared and sad, but maybe also learning that his assumptions were wrong, like when I thought Brussels sprouts would be yucky, but they turned out to be okay." Isaiah smiled at his daughter's analogy, once again amazed by her ability to find hope and possibility, even in difficult situations. "You know what, Zara, I think you're right. And when we get back home, maybe we can help him learn that people are more like Brussels sprouts than he thought." Blake Thornfield's apartment had become a fortress of shame and self-reflection, the curtains drawn against the media circus on the street below. His phone silenced after the 100th call from reporters wanting to interview the man who had become the face of customer service discrimination. For 3 days he had barely left his bedroom, surviving on delivery food, and the kind of brutal honesty that comes when your entire worldview collapses and you're forced to examine the person you've actually been versus the person you thought you were. The viral video played on an endless loop in his mind, but now he saw it from a different perspective, watching his own behavior with the horrified fascination of someone observing a stranger commit acts of casual cruelty. The way he had looked at the Washington family, the assumptions he had made within seconds of seeing them, the certainty that they didn't belong in first class, all of it revealed a prejudice so deeply embedded that he hadn't even recognized it as prejudice. Blake Linda's voice came from the other side of the bedroom door, accompanied by a gentle knock that suggested she was still trying to navigate the balance between supporting her husband and processing her own shock at his behavior. "Emma's asking if she can talk to you." Blake sat up in bed, running his hands through his platinum blonde hair that now seemed like a costume from another life, and tried to imagine facing his 12-year-old daughter after she had seen her father humiliate a family that included a girl only 5 years younger than herself. The thought made him physically sick, but he knew that avoiding the conversation would only make it worse. "Send her in," he said, his voice hoarse from 3 days of crying and self-recrimination. Emma entered the room with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, her expression mixing concern with confusion and something that might have been disappointment. She was wearing her soccer uniform from practice, and Blake realized that he had missed another one of her games, another opportunity to be the father she deserved, instead of the man who had become an international symbol of racism. "Dad," Emma said, sitting on the edge of the bed with the kind of serious demeanor that suggested she had been thinking about this conversation for days. "Can you explain what happened at the airport? Because my friends are saying things, and I don't understand why you were being mean to that family." Blake looked at his daughter's face, seeing his own features reflected in her eyes and nose, and the stubborn set of her jaw, and realized that this conversation would define not just their relationship, but the kind of person Emma would become. He could deflect, make excuses, blame the viral video on editing or misunderstanding, or he could tell her the truth and hope that his honesty might prevent her from inheriting his prejudices. "Emma," he said, taking her hands in his and feeling how small they were, how much trust she was still willing to place in him. "Despite everything, I made a terrible mistake. I looked at a black family and assumed they didn't belong in first class because of the color of their skin, and I treated them badly based on that assumption. Emma's eyes widened as she processed this admission, her 12-year-old mind working through the implications of her father's confession. "But Dad, that's racism. We learned about that in school. Martin Luther King said people should be judged by their character, not their color." "You're absolutely right." Blake said, the words coming easier than he had expected. "What I did was racist, and it was wrong, and I hurt that family for no reason other than my own prejudice and ignorance." "But why?" Emma asked, her voice small and confused. "You taught me to be nice to everyone. You said it doesn't matter what people look like or where they come from." Blake realized that he had been living a contradiction for years, teaching his daughter values that he didn't actually practice, preaching tolerance while harboring biases that he had never examined or challenged. Sometimes adults say things they believe in their heads but don't actually feel in their hearts. "I thought I wasn't racist because I never used bad words or joined hate groups, but I was making assumptions and judgments that were just as harmful." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness that came from realizing that adults weren't as perfect or wise as she had believed. "Are you going to apologize to that family?" "I want to," Blake said, "but I'm not sure they want to hear from me. Sometimes when you hurt people, the best thing you can do is leave them alone and focus on making sure you never hurt anyone else the same way." Maybe Emma said with the practical wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "But if I hurt someone's feelings, Mom always says I should apologize even if it's scary or embarrassing." That night, after Emma had gone to bed and Linda had retreated to the guest bedroom to give Blake space to process his thoughts, he sat at his computer and began researching racism, unconscious bias, and the history of discrimination in America. It was education he should have pursued years ago. Books he should have read, perspectives he should have considered, but he had been comfortable in his assumptions and lazy in his thinking. He read about redlining and housing discrimination, about the wealth gap that had persisted for generations after the end of legal segregation, about the countless small humiliations and barriers that people of color faced every day in professional and social settings. He watched documentaries about the civil rights movement, listened to podcasts about modern racism, and gradually began to understand how his own attitudes and behaviors fit into a larger pattern of exclusion and prejudice. The research was painful, forcing him to confront not just his treatment of the Washington family, but years of decisions and assumptions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now revealed themselves as manifestations of racial bias. His brand standards at Skywings, his passenger screening procedures, his confidence that he could identify problematic customers by their appearance. All of it was part of a structure that privileged people who looked like him while creating barriers for people who didn't. But the most devastating realization came when he found himself reading about the psychological effects of discrimination on children, about how being treated with suspicion and disrespect in public spaces could damage a child's sense of self-worth and belonging. He thought about Zara Washington's confused question, "Why won't the man let us on the plane?" and realized that his actions had contributed to a 7-year-old's education in the realities of racism. On his 4th day of isolation and reflection, Blake received an unexpected email from Dr. Isaiah Washington. The message was brief and professional, but it contained an offer that Blake had not expected the opportunity to participate in a facilitated dialogue about the incident with the goal of understanding what had happened and preventing similar situations in the future. Mr. Thornfield. The email read, "I believe that people can learn and grow from their mistakes, and I'm willing to explore whether your experience might become part of a larger conversation about bias, education, and change. If you're interested in participating in a mediated discussion about what happened and what we can learn from it, please let me know." Blake stared at the email for hours, reading it over and over again, and trying to understand why Isaiah Washington would be willing to engage with the man who had humiliated his family. The generosity of the offer was overwhelming, the recognition that even Blake deserved a chance at redemption and learning. But it was also terrifying because it would require him to face the Washington family again. to acknowledge his mistakes in front of the people he had wronged, to open himself to their anger and disappointment and pain. It would be easier to simply disappear, to move to another city and start over, to pretend that none of this had ever happened. Linda, he called to his wife, who had been navigating her own crisis of understanding as she processed her husband's behavior and its implications for their family. "Can you come in here? I need to talk to you about something important." She appeared in the doorway with the cautious expression that had become her default over the past few days, still trying to reconcile the man she had married with the man she had seen on the viral video. "What is it? Dr. Washington has invited me to participate in a dialogue about what happened," Blake said, showing her the email. "Some kind of mediated conversation where we can discuss the incident and try to learn from it." Linda read the email carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Are you going to do it?" "I think I have to," Blake said. "Not because I owe it to him, though I do, but because I owe it to Emma, to you, to myself. I need to understand how I became the kind of person who could treat a family that way, and I need to figure out how to become someone better." Linda nodded slowly. "It's going to be difficult." "Yes," Blake agreed. "But maybe that's exactly what I need." The conference room at the Marriott in downtown Detroit was deliberately neutral, chosen specifically because it had no connection to either Skywing's Airlines or any of Blake Thornfield's previous workplaces, a space where the Washington family and Blake could meet on equal ground without the weight of corporate hierarchy or professional relationships affecting their conversation. Dr. Rosa Martinez, a nationally recognized expert in restorative justice and racial reconciliation, had flown in from California to facilitate what she expected to be one of the most challenging dialogues of her 20-year career. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at JFK Airport, 3 weeks during which the viral video had been viewed over 50 million times and had sparked conversations about racism, privilege, and accountability in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across America. Blake Thornfield had spent those weeks in intensive preparation for this meeting, working with a therapist who specialized in unconscious bias and reading everything he could find about racism, discrimination, and the experiences of Black families in predominantly white spaces. Isaiah Washington arrived at the hotel with Keisha, and surprisingly with Zara, whose presence had been her own choice after learning about the planned meeting. "I want to talk to Mr. Blake," she had told her parents with the straightforward determination that characterized her approach to most challenges. "I think maybe he needs to hear from me about how it felt." Dr. Martinez began the session by establishing ground rules and expectations, explaining that the goal was not to assign blame or extract apologies, but to create understanding between people whose lives had intersected in a moment of crisis. This process is about truth-telling, about examining how we got to that moment at the airport, and about exploring whether that moment can become a catalyst for growth and change. Blake sat across the table from the Washington family, his hands folded in his lap, his usual corporate confidence replaced by a vulnerability that made him seem younger and smaller than his 38 years. He had lost weight over the past 3 weeks, his expensive suits no longer fitting properly, his platinum blonde hair in need of styling, the physical manifestations of a man whose entire sense of self had been dismantled and was slowly being rebuilt. "Dr. Washington, Mrs. Washington, Zara," he began, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed each member of the family by name. "I want to start by acknowledging the pain I caused you. What I did at the airport was wrong. It was hurtful. And it was based on racist assumptions that I had no right to make about your family." Isaiah nodded, his expression serious but not hostile. "I appreciate that acknowledgement, Blake. Can you help us understand what was going through your mind that morning? What led you to treat our family the way you did?" Blake took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment when he would have to examine and articulate the prejudices that had seemed so natural and justified at the time. I think I had convinced myself that I was protecting the airline's interests, maintaining what I called brand standards. But the truth is that I had developed a mental profile of what first-class passengers should look like, and your family didn't match that profile. What did that profile look like? Keisha asked, her surgeon's precision evident in the way she cut directly to the heart of the issue. White mostly. Blake admitted the words coming like a physical confession. Middle-aged business travelers in expensive suits. People who looked like they belonged in corporate boardrooms or country clubs. When I saw your family in casual clothes, my first thought wasn't that you might be successful professionals taking a vacation with your children. My first thought was that there must be some mistake, some fraud, some reason why you had access to seats that I didn't think you could afford. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, guiding the conversation toward deeper examination. Blake, can you trace where those assumptions came from? What experiences or influences shaped your ideas about who belongs in first class? Blake was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the self-examination that the question required. I think it goes back to my childhood, to the messages I received about success and status and who deserves what. My parents weren't wealthy, but they aspired to wealth, and they taught me that rich people looked a certain way, acted a certain way, earned their privileges through hard work and proper behavior. And black people didn't fit into that narrative. Isaiah asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Not in my experience, Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I grew up in a predominantly white suburb, went to predominantly white schools, worked in predominantly white corporations. Most of the black people I encountered were in service positions, support roles, jobs that reinforced my unconscious beliefs about hierarchy and capability. Zara, who had been listening quietly while coloring in a book that Dr. Martinez had provided, looked up at Blake with the direct gaze that adults often found unsettling in children. Mr. Blake, did you think we weren't smart enough to have money? The question hit Blake like a physical blow, the innocence of Zara's inquiry highlighting the absurdity and cruelty of his assumptions. I think I thought that people who had money would dress differently, would carry themselves differently, would look more like me. But we were dressed nicely. Zara continued, her 7-year-old logic cutting through adult complexities with devastating clarity. And we were being polite and quiet and not bothering anybody. So why did you think we were lying about our tickets? Blake looked at this small girl who had been collateral damage in his moment of prejudice and realized that her questions were more penetrating than any cross-examination by a hostile attorney could have been. Because I had learned to associate success with whiteness, and I had never examined that assumption or questioned whether it might be wrong. What has examining that assumption taught you over the past 3 weeks? Dr. Martinez asked, steering the conversation toward Blake's process of learning and growth. That I was ignorant about the experiences of black professionals, black families, black success, Blake replied. I had no idea about the wealth gap created by historical discrimination, about the barriers that successful black families still face, about the constant navigation of predominantly white spaces that your family and families like yours have to do every day. Isaiah leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Blake, when you made those assumptions about our family, how do you think it affected our children? What message do you think Zara and Caleb received about their place in the world? Blake's eyes filled with tears as he considered the question, thinking about his own daughter Emma and how she would feel if someone questioned her right to exist in a space where she belonged. I think I taught them that their worthiness would always be questioned, that their success would always be suspicious, that they would have to prove themselves in ways that white children don't. And how does that make you feel? Keisha asked, her medical training evident in the way she probed for emotional understanding alongside intellectual acknowledgement. Ashamed, Blake said, his voice breaking. Horrified that I contributed to that kind of damage. Determined to make sure that I never again participate in making any child feel that way. Doctor, Martinez recognized that they had reached a crucial moment in the dialogue, the point where acknowledgement of harm could potentially transform into commitment to change. Blake, what are you prepared to do differently going forward? How will you ensure that your behavior aligns with your new understanding? Blake straightened in his chair, his voice growing stronger as he moved from confession toward commitment. I want to accept Dr. Washington's offer to work in customer service at Skywings to learn firsthand what respectful treatment looks like from the perspective of every passenger, regardless of their background or appearance. I want to participate in bias training, not just for myself, but as someone who can help other employees recognize and overcome their own unconscious prejudices. That's a good start, Isaiah said. But I'm curious about your long-term vision for yourself. How do you see this experience changing who you are as a person, as a father, as a member of your community? I want to become someone my daughter can be proud of. Blake replied, his voice steady now with conviction. Someone who stands up for inclusion instead of defending exclusion. Someone who questions his assumptions instead of acting on them blindly. I want to be an advocate for the kind of change that prevents other families from experiencing what I put your family through. Zara looked up from her coloring book again, her expression serious as she considered Blake's words. Mr. Blake, if you work really hard to be better, and if you help other people learn not to make the same mistakes, then maybe something good can come from the bad thing that happened. The simplicity of her statement, the generous spirit that could envision redemption emerging from harm, created a moment of profound silence in the conference room. Blake wiped his eyes and looked at this remarkable child who had just offered him a path toward forgiveness and growth. Zara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to make sure that something good comes from this, that other children and their families are treated better because of what we've all learned from this experience. Dr. Martinez concluded the session by having each participant articulate their commitments going forward. Isaiah pledged to use his position as owner of Skywings to implement comprehensive bias training and inclusive policies throughout the aviation industry. Keisha committed to sharing their family's experience in ways that could educate healthcare professionals and other service providers about treating all patients and customers with dignity. Zara announced that she wanted to write a book about how people can learn to see past their first impressions to discover the goodness in others. And Blake Thornfield, the man who had become an international symbol of customer service discrimination, committed himself to a lifetime of learning growth and advocacy for the kind of inclusion that his prejudices had once prevented him from seeing. As they left the hotel conference room, Blake approached the Washington family one final time. I know that forgiveness isn't something I can ask for or expect, he said. But I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the second chance you've given me. Isaiah extended his hand for a handshake that represented not friendship exactly, but the possibility of shared purpose in creating a more just and inclusive world. Everyone deserves the opportunity to become better than they were yesterday, Blake. The question is what you do with that opportunity. 6 months after the incident that had transformed both Skywings Airlines and Blake Thornfield's life, the aviation industry was experiencing the most comprehensive examination of customer service practices in its history. The International Aviation Inclusion Alliance, founded in the aftermath of the viral video, had grown to include 47 airlines from 6 continents, all committed to implementing standardized training programs designed to eliminate bias and discrimination in passenger services. Blake Thornfield arrived for his shift at JFK Terminal 4 at 6 a.m. wearing the navy blue uniform of a Skywings customer service representative, a position that represented both a dramatic demotion from his previous role and a profound elevation in his understanding of what hospitality actually meant. His job now involved greeting passengers, helping with boarding processes, and resolving travel problems with the kind of patience and empathy that had been entirely absent from his previous approach to airline management. Good morning. Mr. Thornfield, said Angela Morrison, the terminal supervisor who had been promoted to regional management after Blake's departure, her tone professional but warm as she reviewed the day's flight schedule with him. We've got 3 international departures this morning, including the London flight that leaves from Gate 12. Gate 12 had been redesigned since the incident with new signage emphasizing Skywing's commitment to inclusive service and photographs featuring diverse families enjoying air travel together. The physical changes were symbolic of deeper transformations throughout the company, from hiring practices that actively recruited diverse employees to training programs that required all staff to complete 40 hours of bias education before interacting with passengers. Blake's transformation had been documented and studied as part of the industry-wide initiative, his journey from prejudiced manager to inclusive advocate, serving as a case study for how individuals could overcome unconscious bias through education, accountability, and sustained commitment to change. His monthly reports to Dr. Washington detailed not just his job performance, but his ongoing learning process, his participation in community diversity programs, and his speaking engagements at other companies seeking to address similar cultural problems. Dr. Washington called this morning, Angela informed him as they walked through the terminal. He wanted to know if you'd be interested in participating in the keynote presentation at next week's Aviation Diversity Conference. Apparently, there's significant interest in hearing your perspective on personal transformation and cultural change. The invitation represented how far Blake had come in his understanding of his role in addressing discrimination, but it also highlighted the ongoing nature of his commitment to change. Public speaking about his mistakes remained difficult and emotionally challenging, but he had learned that sharing his story could prevent other people from making similar assumptions and treating other families with similar disrespect. At Gate 12, Blake began his morning routine of greeting passengers and assisting with boarding procedures, his interactions marked by the kind of genuine attention and care that came from understanding that every person deserved respect, regardless of their appearance or background. A young black mother traveling alone with twin toddlers approached the gate, looking stressed and overwhelmed, clearly expecting the kind of complications that often accompanied air travel with small children. "Good morning," Blake said, his tone immediately warm and supportive. "I'm Blake, and I'm here to help make your travel experience as smooth as possible. What can I do to assist you and your beautiful children today?" The relief on the woman's face was immediate, her shoulders relaxing as she realized she had encountered someone who saw her as a valued customer rather than a potential problem. "I'm worried about managing the twins during boarding," she admitted. "They're at that age where they want to run everywhere, and I don't want to disturb other passengers. Let me arrange pre-boarding for you," Blake replied, already reaching for his radio to coordinate with the gate agents. "We'll get you settled comfortably before the general boarding begins, and I'll personally make sure you have everything you need for the flight." Interactions like this had become routine for Blake, each one representing not just good customer service, but active anti-racism. The deliberate choice to provide exceptional care to passengers who might have previously experienced suspicion or dismissal. His colleagues had initially been skeptical of his transformation, wondering whether his commitment to change was genuine or simply career preservation, but months of consistent behavior had earned their respect and trust. The success of Blake's personal transformation had become part of Skywings' broader reputation as an industry leader in inclusive service. Customer satisfaction scores had reached historic highs, employee retention had improved dramatically, and the airline had received multiple awards for its commitment to diversity and inclusion. More importantly, discrimination complaints had dropped to nearly zero, suggesting that the cultural changes implemented throughout the company were creating real improvements in passenger experiences. During his lunch break, Blake checked his phone to find a text message from his daughter Emma, who was now 13, and had become one of his strongest supporters in his journey toward becoming a better person. "Dad, my civics teacher wants to interview you for our project on how people can change and grow. Are you okay with that?" The message made Blake smile, remembering how terrified he had been a year earlier about his daughter learning of his discriminatory behavior. Emma's pride in his transformation and growth had become one of the most important motivations for his continued commitment to change, the recognition that personal transformation could inspire, rather than shame, the people who loved him. As his shift continued, Blake found himself reflecting on the distance he had traveled from the person who had humiliated the Washington family to the person who now spent his days ensuring that all families felt welcomed and respected. The journey had been difficult, requiring him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own prejudices and assumptions, but it had also been redemptive in ways he couldn't have imagined. At the end of his shift, as Blake prepared to leave the terminal, he passed a photograph that had been installed near Gate 12 as part of the memorial display commemorating the incident and its aftermath. The image showed the Washington family boarding Flight 847 with dignity and grace. Zara's bright purple dress visible as she walked hand in hand with her father toward their future. Blake paused in front of the photograph as he did every day, and silently renewed his commitment to ensuring that every family who passed through his terminal would be treated with the same respect and dignity that the Washingtons had deserved, but initially been denied. The Grand Theater in downtown Detroit had been transformed for the evening into something that felt more like a celebration than a typical movie premiere, with warm lighting, diverse flowers, and an atmosphere of anticipation that suggested the audience was about to witness something genuinely meaningful rather than just another corporate documentary. 1 year to the day after the incident at JFK Airport, over 800 people had gathered to watch Turning Points, a family's journey from humiliation to healing. A 90-minute film that chronicled not just what had happened that morning at Gate 12, but everything that had emerged from that moment of crisis. The Washington family arrived to find themselves greeted by a diverse crowd that included airline employees, civil rights activists, business leaders, and families from across the Detroit metropolitan area who had been following their story and supporting the changes it had inspired. Zara, now 8 years old, and wearing a bright yellow dress that made her look like a small beacon of hope, waved enthusiastically at the photographers while maintaining the kind of confident composure that suggested she had grown comfortable with public attention. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing to a banner hanging above the theater entrance that read, "Healing through Understanding, 1 year of change. They made a sign about us. Do you think this means we're famous?" Isaiah smiled down at his daughter, marveling at how she had processed the events of the past year with the resilience and wisdom that seemed to come naturally to children who had been raised with love and confidence. "I think it means that people are interested in the ideas you helped us learn about forgiveness and growth, baby girl. The story isn't really about us being famous. It's about everyone learning to be kinder to each other." Inside the theater, the audience included faces that told the broader story of transformation that had emerged from that single incident. Margaret Chen sat with the Skywings board of directors, all of whom had become advocates for the industry-wide changes that Isaiah had championed. Dr. Rosa Martinez was present with colleagues from the restorative justice community who had been studying the Washington Thornfield dialogue as a model for addressing racial bias in corporate settings. And in the back row, wearing a simple black suit and sitting with his wife Linda and daughter Emma, was Blake Thornfield, whose presence represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. His transformation from antagonist to advocate had been documented throughout the film, but his willingness to attend the premiere, to face the public scrutiny that would inevitably come with being seen as supporting the family he had once humiliated, demonstrated the depth of his commitment to change. Before we begin, the screening announced Dr. Patricia Williams, a renowned civil rights scholar who was serving as the evening's host. I want to acknowledge the courage it took for everyone involved in this story to share their experiences so openly, to allow their private pain and growth to become part of a larger conversation about justice, healing, and possibility. The documentary itself was masterfully crafted, weaving together the original viral video footage with interviews conducted throughout the year, behind-the-scenes looks at the industry changes that had been implemented, and intimate conversations with the Washington family about their decision to choose restoration over retaliation. The filmmakers had been given unprecedented access to both Skywings' internal transformation process and Blake's personal journey of education and growth. One of the most powerful segments featured Zara's perspective on the events, her 8-year-old wisdom providing insights that adult analysis might have missed. "I think sometimes grown-ups forget that everybody's feelings are real," she said in an interview segment filmed in her family's living room. "Mr. Blake's feelings were real when he was scared, and our feelings were real when he was being mean to us. And the important thing is that we all learned how to have better feelings together." The audience watched in emotional silence as the film documented Blake's gradual transformation from the initial confrontation through his termination and public humiliation to his decision to participate in the facilitated dialogue, and finally to his current role as a customer service representative and advocate for inclusive policies. His interviews were raw and honest, showing someone genuinely grappling with the implications of his own prejudices and working to become a fundamentally different person. "I had to learn that changing your mind isn't enough," Blake said in one particularly powerful segment. "You have to change your heart, and you have to change your actions, and you have to keep changing them every single day, because growth isn't something that happens once and then you're finished. It's something you commit to for the rest of your life." The film also showcased the broader industry transformation that had emerged from the incident, with interviews featuring airline executives from around the world discussing the policy changes they had implemented, the training programs they had developed, and the cultural shifts that had occurred within their organizations. Customer testimonials from diverse families showed the real-world impact of these changes. Passengers describing travel experiences that were respectful, welcoming, and inclusive in ways that had previously been inconsistent or absent. As the documentary reached its conclusion, the camera focused on recent footage of Blake working at JFK Airport, his interactions with passengers demonstrating the kind of genuine care and attention that had been missing from his previous approach to customer service. The final scene showed him greeting a Black family with young children, his warmth and professionalism creating exactly the kind of positive experience that should be standard for all travelers. When the lights came up in the theater, the applause was sustained and emotional, the kind of response that suggested the audience had witnessed something genuinely transformative rather than just informative. During the question and answer session that followed, audience members asked thoughtful questions about implementation of bias training, the challenges of measuring cultural change, and the possibility of applying similar approaches to other industries and institutions. Doctor. Washington asked a young woman who identified herself as a graduate student studying organizational psychology, "What advice would you give to other business leaders who want to address discrimination and bias within their own companies?" Isaiah stood to address the question, his presence commanding the attention of the entire theater. "I think the most important thing is to recognize that changing policies isn't enough if you're not also changing hearts and minds. You can mandate training and create accountability measures, but lasting transformation requires people to genuinely understand why inclusive treatment isn't just the right thing to do morally, but also the best thing to do for business success and human flourishing." An older man in the middle section raised his hand and asked Mr. Thornfield, "What would you say to people who might be resistant to examining their own biases or participating in this kind of education?" Blake stood slowly, clearly still uncomfortable with public speaking, but committed to sharing his perspective when it might help others. "I would say that I understand the resistance, because I felt it too. It's painful to realize that you've been hurting people without meaning to, that your assumptions and behaviors have caused real damage. But the alternative, continuing to live with prejudices that harm others and ultimately diminish yourself, is much worse than the discomfort of growth and learning." The evening concluded with remarks from Zara herself, who had asked to address the audience despite her young age. Standing at the podium with a confidence that belied her 8 years, she spoke with the kind of clarity that had characterized her approach to the entire situation from the beginning. "I think the most important thing I learned this year," she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the theater, "is that when bad things happen, you get to choose what comes next. You can choose to stay angry and sad, or you can choose to help everybody learn how to be nicer. And if you choose the helping way, then the bad thing becomes a good thing, because it makes the world a little bit better for other kids and families." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, with audience members wiping their eyes and embracing each other as they processed the emotional weight of what they had witnessed. As people began to file out of the theater, many stopped to speak with the Washington family, and Blake expressing gratitude for their courage in sharing their story and their commitment to creating positive change from a moment of crisis. Outside the theater, as the Washington family prepared to leave, Blake approached them with Linda and Emma, all three of them clearly moved by the evening's experience. "Dr. Washington, Mrs. Washington, Zara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to thank you again for believing that people can change, for giving me the opportunity to become someone better than I was." Zara looked up at Blake with the direct gaze that had become her trademark, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and giving him a hug. "Mr. Blake," she said, "I'm proud of you for learning how to be kind, and I'm glad we're friends now instead of being mad at each other." The simple gesture, captured by photographers and later shared millions of times across social media, became the defining image of the entire story. A young black girl embracing a white man who had once treated her family with contempt, both of them representing the possibility of healing growth and genuine transformation in a world that often seemed divided by fear and prejudice. As they all walked toward their cars under the Detroit streetlights, the Washington family and Blake's family side by side, they carried with them not just the satisfaction of having shared their story, but the knowledge that their journey from conflict to understanding would continue to inspire change in countless other lives and institutions. The quiet of the Washington family's living room on Sunday evening felt different from the media attention and public events that had defined so much of their past year. A return to the kind of peaceful domesticity that had been interrupted by Blake Thornfield's assumptions and prejudices, but had ultimately been strengthened by the journey of growth and healing that followed. Zara was curled up in her father's lap, working on a new picture book that she had decided to write about friendship and forgiveness, while Caleb built elaborate structures with his building blocks nearby. Daddy, Zara said without looking up from her drawing, "Do you think Mr. Blake is completely fixed now, or do you think he still has to keep learning how to be nice?" The question demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of human growth that Zara had developed over the past year. Her recognition that transformation was an ongoing process, rather than a single moment of change. Isaiah considered his response carefully, knowing that his daughter's perspective on human nature and redemption would be shaped by how he explained the complexities of personal growth. "I think Mr. Blake has learned a lot and changed a lot," Isaiah said, stroking Zara's hair as she worked on her illustration of two children sharing toys on an airplane. "But I also think that becoming a better person is something we all have to work on every single day. It's like brushing your teeth or doing your homework. It's not something you do once and then you're finished forever. So even good people have to keep practicing." "Being good?" Zara asked, the concept clearly resonating with her experience of learning new skills through repetition and effort. "Especially good people," Keisha added from her chair across the room where she was reviewing medical journals, but clearly listening to the conversation with one ear. "The people who care about being good are the ones who keep trying to get better, who keep learning and growing and examining their own hearts to make sure they're treating everyone with kindness and respect." Isaiah's phone buzzed with a text message from Blake, who had developed a habit of sending weekly updates about his experiences and learning process. The message included a photograph of Blake with a diverse group of Skywing's employees at a training session, all of them smiling and engaged in what appeared to be a productive discussion about inclusive customer service. "Look at this," Isaiah said, showing the photo to his family. "Mr. Blake is helping train new employees about how to treat all passengers respectfully. He's using what he learned from making mistakes to help other people avoid making the same mistakes." The transformation that Blake had undergone continued to amaze Isaiah, not just because of the personal growth it represented, but because of the ripple effects it was creating throughout the aviation industry and beyond. Blake's speaking engagements at other companies, his participation in bias training programs, and his ongoing commitment to customer service excellence had made him an unlikely but effective advocate for the kind of cultural change that prevented discrimination and promoted inclusion. "I got a letter at school from a girl in California," Zara announced, pulling a folded piece of paper from her backpack and showing it to her parents. "She said she saw the movie about us, and now her family isn't scared to fly anymore because they know that airlines are learning to be nicer to everyone." The letter was one of dozens that the Washington family had received over the past year. Messages from families around the world who had been inspired by their decision to choose healing over hatred, education over litigation, transformation over simple punishment. Each letter reinforced Isaiah's conviction that their experience had contributed to something larger and more important than individual justice. It had become a catalyst for changes that would benefit countless other families. "You know what I've been thinking about," Isaiah said. "Closing his laptop and giving his full attention to his family is how we can keep this momentum going. How we can make sure that the changes we've started continue to grow and spread to other industries and other situations where people might be treated unfairly because of assumptions and prejudices." Keisha looked up from her journal with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "I've been talking with some other business leaders about creating a foundation." Isaiah explained, his excitement growing as he outlined the vision that had been developing in his mind over recent weeks. "Something focused on funding education programs, supporting bias training initiatives, and helping companies implement the kind of inclusive practices that we've developed at Skywings." And he continued, looking at Zara with a smile. "I think this foundation should have a youth component where kids can share their perspectives on fairness and inclusion, because sometimes children understand these issues more clearly than adults do." Zara's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Could I help with that? Could I tell other kids about how we learned to turn a bad thing into a good thing?" "I think you'd be perfect for that," Isaiah replied. "You've already shown that you have wisdom about these issues that most grown-ups are still trying to learn." As the evening continued, the Washington family found themselves planning not just their individual futures, but their ongoing contribution to the movement for justice and inclusion that had emerged from their experience. Keisha talked about incorporating bias awareness into medical training programs, recognizing that healthcare disparities often stemmed from the same kinds of assumptions that had led to their airport confrontation. "I keep thinking about that moment when Blake first saw us," Keisha said thoughtfully, "and how much pain and injustice could be prevented if people learned to question their first impressions, to look past their assumptions and see the humanity in everyone they encounter." The conversation was interrupted by another text message from Blake, this one containing a photograph that made the entire family smile. It showed Blake's daughter Emma wearing a Skywings customer service uniform, participating in a Bring Your Child to Work Day event at JFK Airport. The message read, "Emma wants to follow her dad's example of learning how to serve others with respect and kindness. She says she wants to help make sure all families feel welcome when they travel." "Look at that," Zara said, studying the photograph with satisfaction. "Mr. Blake's daughter is learning the good lessons instead of the bad ones. That means the good things are going to keep growing even when we're all grown up." As they prepared for bed that evening, Isaiah reflected on how profoundly their lives had been changed by a single moment of prejudice and injustice, and how that moment had become the foundation for a lifetime of work toward creating a more inclusive and compassionate world. The pain of that morning at JFK would always be part of their family's story, but so would the healing growth and positive change that had emerged from their decision to respond with grace and wisdom rather than anger and retaliation. "Sweet dreams, baby girl," he said, tucking Zara into bed beneath her favorite blanket, covered with airplanes and stars. "Tomorrow we get to keep making the world a little bit better." "Tomorrow and every day after that," Zara replied sleepily, already dreaming of friendship, forgiveness, and the endless possibilities that came from choosing hope over hatred. 1 year and 2 weeks after the incident that had changed everything, the Washington family found themselves back at JFK Terminal 4, preparing for another flight to London for a follow-up meeting with the International Aviation Inclusion Alliance. The terminal looked the same but felt completely different, transformed not by physical changes, but by the cultural revolution that had emerged from their experience and spread throughout the aviation industry. As they approached Gate 12, Zara spotted a familiar figure in a Skywings customer service uniform, his platinum blonde hair now shorter and more modest. His demeanor focused on helping an elderly couple navigate the boarding process with patience and genuine care. Blake Thornfield had requested this assignment, specifically wanting to greet the Washington family personally on their return journey and demonstrate how completely his approach to customer service had evolved. "Hi, Mr. Blake," Zara called out with the enthusiasm of someone greeting an old friend, her bright voice carrying across the boarding area and drawing smiles from other passengers who recognized the significance of the moment. Blake turned toward her voice, his face lighting up with the kind of genuine warmth that had been entirely absent from their first encounter. "Zara Doctor and Mrs. Washington, it's wonderful to see you all again. Are you ready for another adventure to London? Are you still learning to be nice?" Zara asked with her characteristic directness, the question that had become her signature way of checking on people's ongoing growth and development. Blake knelt down to her level, his expression serious but filled with affection for this remarkable child who had taught him so much about forgiveness and possibility. "Every day, Miss Zara. Every single day I learn something new about how to be kinder, how to see people more clearly, how to make sure that every family feels as welcome and respected as yours should have felt from the very beginning." As the boarding process began, Blake personally assisted the Washington family with the kind of attentive service that had become his specialty, ensuring their comfort while treating them exactly the same as every other passenger with dignity, respect, and genuine care. Other Skywings employees paused to watch the interaction, many of them aware of the history, but all of them seeing it now as simply excellent customer service in action. "You know," Isaiah said quietly as Blake checked their boarding passes watching you work. "Now, seeing how you treat every passenger with such care and attention, it reminds me that people really can change when they commit themselves to growth." "Thank you for believing that was possible," Blake replied, his voice carrying the gratitude of someone whose life had been fundamentally transformed by mercy and opportunity. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become someone my daughter can be proud of." As Flight 847 pushed back from Gate 12 and began its taxi toward the runway, Zara pressed her face against the window and waved down at Blake, who stood on the tarmac, making sure their departure was smooth and safe. The airplane rose into the sky, carrying not just passengers, but a message of hope that echoed across an industry and beyond that change was possible, that growth was achievable, and that even the worst moments could become catalysts for creating a more just and compassionate world. The sky, as Zara had written in her upcoming children's book, was indeed big enough for everyone. The Washington Skywings incident sparked the most comprehensive civil rights transformation in aviation history. Within 18 months, the International Aviation Inclusion Alliance grew to include over 200 airlines worldwide, implementing standardized bias training and passenger dignity protocols. Federal legislation in 12 countries now mandates discrimination prevention measures with severe penalties for both individuals and corporations that violate passenger rights. Blake Thornfield became a leading advocate for unconscious bias education, speaking at Fortune 500 companies about transformation and accountability. His partnership with the Washington Foundation has trained over 50,000 customer service employees across multiple industries. Zara's children's book, The Sky Belongs to Everyone, has sold 2 million copies and is now required reading in diversity education programs nationwide. Most importantly, the story demonstrates that true justice lies not in destroying those who wrong us, but in creating opportunities for growth and redemption that benefit everyone. When we choose restoration over retaliation, education over elimination, we build a world where dignity and respect become the standard rather than the exception. As Zara wrote, "When we help people learn to be better, we all get to live in a better world." If this story moved you and made you believe in the power of transformation over punishment, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share your own experiences with bias or discrimination in the comments below. Let's continue this important conversation about creating a more inclusive world. Next week, we're bringing you another incredible story about justice redemption and the courage to choose hope over hatred. Thank you for watching, and remember, change is always possible when we choose understanding over anger.